Around this time of year, anywhere in the northern hemisphere, summer is giving way to fall, and traditionally, everywhere in the world, fall is a time of giving thanks. It's a time of thanksgiving. And so there's pretty straightforward reasons for that. Summer crops are harvested just around this time of the harvest moon. It was a few weeks ago. Granaries are filled. Winter is just around the corner. And because of the bounty that people have been able to get through the summer months, they're able to survive through the winter months. To a large extent, modern methods of transportation have done away with this reality of life that in an agrarian society everybody feels very keenly. But you can go to a Ralph's, for instance, down the street, and even sometimes to a sophisticated gas station, and you can get fresh fruit from thousands of miles away. Exotic fruit, you buy dragon fruit, or Australian mangoes, or whatever the case may be. Even sometimes in the wintertime, you can go south of the equator and you can get things, because your winter is their summer, and so you can get summer fruits in the wintertime flown with cold storage, and a lot of times you don't have to walk any further than a block. And in many ways, the same way that modern technology has enabled you to speak to someone 8,000 miles away, or even, when I was a kid growing up, Star Wars came out when I was a kid. I think I was 5 when Star Wars came out. I saw it in the movie theater. There was a whole hologram thing. If you guys remember the original Star Wars movie, but there was a hologram image that was sort of the cornerstone of the movie. It was this hologram image of Princess Leia asking Obi-Wan Kenobi for help, and that became the genesis of the whole hero's journey, was this message. And it seemed fantastic. There was a 3-dimensional hologram figure, but that's not even impressive nowadays. That doesn't even really move the needle anymore. And so in a lot of ways, modern technology minimizes space differences and even to some extent differences in time. And you have access to a tremendous amount of information and to what went on in the past, what goes on in the future. You can look up through a search engine, you can find out what was on the internet 20 years ago. They have a kind of save the internet feature where you can go back and look at what was there. If it had been removed in due course of time, you can go back and see what it looked like a long time ago. And in the same way that we all have experience of that happening with technology, before we were born, unless you grew up in an agrarian situation, my whole life I grew up, you could just go down to the grocery store and pick up anything you wanted to. I don't remember a time where that wasn't possible. This was very much the case pre-World War I. The world had become quite globalized pre-World War I, and World War I actually moved the world back tremendously in terms of globalization and the free trade of goods between countries. And so in a lot of ways, if you grew up in the 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s, you had less access to things than if you grew up in the early 1900s. But certainly by the 70s, when I was growing up, by the 80s, there was just you could get almost anything at any time. 7-Elevens. There's probably other, but Circle K's and 7-Elevens when I was growing up, there were these 24-hour supermarkets where there was no limit to what you could buy. If you go elsewhere in the world, Like I was in Greece recently, and my son injured himself, and we'd arrived on an island at 11 o'clock at night, and my son had injured himself such that he needed to go to the hospital. But we were on an island in the middle of nowhere, and there was we had to boat in. We drove on a speedboat to get to the island. And then when we got to the island, of course, 5 seconds later, my son ripped his knee to shreds. And even in 2022, we had to figure out what we were going to do. They had a doctor on the island, but he just graduated medical school, hadn't done his residency, and he just looked at my son's knee and said, "Oh, I can't fix that." Like as if that was an acceptable answer, you know. So I don't know how to fix that. I'm sorry. And so I immediately called the boatman and said, "Hey, we got to go back to the other island. It has a hospital on it." And then they started waking up the doctor on that other island. We're going to get him out of bed, and we're going to take a speedboat. He was like, "Oh, it's $1,000 for a speedboat." I was just, okay, that's what it is. And then the boatman said, "Well, wait a second, hang on." And it turned out he was having dinner with an orthopedic surgeon literally next door to the doctor's house where we were sitting at. The doctor, of course, was dressed in shorts and a t-shirt wearing flip-flops and looked to be the age of, my 20-year-old. And then just next door, they were having dinner, and the orthopedic surgeon came over and looked at my son's knee and said, "Yeah, I'll fix that now." And he started looking around. The doctor says, "Oh, that thread will work for the internal stitches, and that thread will work for the external stitches." And what do you have? You got lidocaine? Okay, well, that'll be enough lidocaine. "Yeah, we'll make it work." He goes, "Yeah, I'll have you guys taken care of in 5 minutes." And he sewed my son up. My son was fine. Was swimming in the ocean a couple of days later. But I just had this brief experience, just a few weeks ago, where I was in a part of the world in 2022 where you couldn't just drive to a hospital. Or we're vegan. And so we were on the island and we bought them out of granola. We had to wait a week for them to get more granola in. We bought them out of beans. They were just out of beans. Every single store on the island was out of beans, was out of granola, was out of almond milk, was out of soy milk. The island had a couple hundred people living on it. We brought 50, and so we immediately, the population of the island swelled tremendously. And we were like, "Well, what are we supposed to do?" Like, in a week or so, we'll get some more stuff in a week or so. And then bought them out of jam. So, to a large extent, we don't understand what it's like to move with the rhythms of the year. In many ways, modern technology, one of its prime purposes is to remove distance between what you have and what you want, what you have access to and what you want. Because we live in a consumer society, and so there's a premium placed on having things available whenever you want them. 24 hours, 7 days a week. I remembered I was in Japan. This was in the early 90s, 1991, 92, I was in Japan. And I was surprised. I went to get some lemonade from a vending machine. And I remember here, they used to sell cigarettes in vending machines. You may or may not remember this. I remember this. Cigarettes were available in vending machines, which of course certainly the cigarette lobby spent a lot of money getting that approved, but I don't know what the logic was, because a 3-year-old can go to a vending machine with candy money and buy cigarettes. So it seems insane to have something that you can't do until you're 18 years old, arguably you shouldn't do ever, and then it's available to 3-year-olds if they have the right amount of coins. They eventually got rid of that. But I also remember when cigarette ads were on TV. That was a thing at one point. But anyway, I was in Japan, and they were selling sake, rice wine, in vending machines just on the street. And then I was looking for my lemonade, and then there was also the next one over had pornography in a vending machine, because people just didn't want to be separated from their sake and their pornography for even 5 minutes. It had to be available on every street corner. And it really showed you what the people in that neighborhood valued. In many ways, modern technology is designed to shrink the distance between you and the things you crave. And the things people really crave, those are sold at gas stations and 7-Elevens. And the things that people can sometimes do without for a few hours, those things are sold at supermarkets, which are open till midnight, open again at 6. So maybe you can't get mangoes between midnight and 6 a.m. Otherwise, you can get mangoes any time of the year. We don't think like this because we're born in, I don't know, urban sprawl, the urban sprawl that is Southern California, where it's pretty much concrete from the valley to the border to Tijuana. You got concrete just the whole way, unless there's a mountain, and then that'll stand in the way. But otherwise, we've paved everything. Los Angeles is the largest city in the world, not population density wise, but geographically, connected by this incredible system of freeways. So this is where we live, and as such, even if you were born in my time, I was born in 1972, maybe even earlier, if you were born in an urban enough environment, certainly for everybody in Southern California now. I mean, I remember in the 80s when I drove down to San Diego with my father, Orange County was all orange groves. There was nothing. It's completely empty, farmland. So you still see farms on the 405. There's one up in Huntington Beach. There's one up in Garden Grove. You'll see little farms on the side of the freeway with like a couple of cows or something like that. And you're like, what is that doing there? Well, that was everything from LA all the way down to San Diego. It was like that. It was Orange County because it was all orange groves. There were cows on the side of the road. I remember when I moved to Laguna Beach 25 years ago, there was where Quail Hill is, the Quail Hill, massive multi-billion-dollar community, where Quail Hill is, that was all a strawberry farm. They were growing strawberries there. I remember stopping there and buying strawberries, like at the farm stand. So the world's changed dramatically, and so it's hard to kind of put yourself in this space. But there is a rhythm of the world where seasons happen, and you grow crops, and then you have to harvest those crops, you have to save them, and then that sees you through the winter months, which of course we don't experience here at all. Everywhere else, winter means you could theoretically die if you don't build a fire or have central heating. Here, winter means like I'm wearing a jacket. But if you're from Chicago, this would be beach weather. Like right now, be like, oh, let's just go to the beach right now. People will be walking around in Speedos with their shirts off. You go to Chicago, it's 40 degrees out. People are walking around with their shirts off and hailing that spring has just arrived. What to speak of if you go a little north, like to Minnesota or something like that. Strangely, if you look at a map, there's sections of Michigan and Minnesota which are north of Toronto, where it's not just a straight line to Canada. It goes like this. And we have some sections of at least of Michigan, I think perhaps of Minnesota as well, that are just north of Toronto, right? It's wild, isn't it? We're just, Southern California, if it's not 68 to 73 degrees, people start to freak out. So to appreciate this month, to really appreciate it. The only thing we experience is like that it gets dark a little earlier. We experience that the day gets a little shorter, and that freaks people out. The day gets a little shorter. It's like, oh my God. Maybe it drizzles a bit. They also plant cool trees that aren't native to here, so you can see the trees change colors. You can go on Crown Valley and drive out on Crown Valley and see some trees change color because they've imported oak trees and other trees that aren't native to this place. And you can see it. We have tons of eucalyptus trees here in Southern California. I'm really off on a tangent now. They're all from Australia. Eucalyptus isn't native to Southern California either. Somebody brought them over and then they took off. We have a bunch of flora and fauna like that where somebody brought something over and it just proliferated and almost became an issue. But yeah, fruit in season. It's grown locally. It just tastes different. Fresh grains. If you harvest wheat and then grind the wheat on the spot and make flour out of, you have to dry it first. You make flour out of fresh ground wheat. It's a whole different experience. It's a whole different experience. I was just watching a video on Instagram earlier today of an Indian woman working with a mortar and pestle to grind grains with a hand mortar and pestle, not with a machine. And she was super fit. And the post was like, yeah, I'm fit because I grind grains every day to feed my family. And all my neighbors who bought all these convenience items, they're all obese and they're going to die sooner and they're pre-diabetic. And if you just lived like this, everyone would be healthy again. And she's, working up sweat, with a big, not like a small little, not like for spices, but a big one that you use for grinding dal and you use for grinding grains. So this time of the year, the reason why Thanksgiving is now, and so is Canadian Thanksgiving, and so is the Mid-Autumn Festival in China and everything else in the Northern Hemisphere. The reason why, or Diwali is here, is because it's a time of Thanksgiving. And that's our month, and there's a story that we have from our sacred tradition that we recall and that we tell that epitomizes the thing that we're most grateful for. And so, people are thankful for their daily bread or for forgiving their trespasses or for creature comforts or for their family or their health, or for the food that they've just grown, even in an agrarian society. Oftentimes you're thankful for these immediate necessities of life. We take things for granted like air, oxygen, water, but as soon as those things run out, all of a sudden, those are the only things that matter. You might think, your children matter. Take away your oxygen supply, and we'll see how long your children matter for. How they always say, put on your mask first before you put on your kid's mask? Honestly, I think that if they didn't say that, it would get done anyway. Because if you can't breathe, you blank out. That's why you can't swim right up to a drowning person. Because even if you swim up to your drowning parent, it's an autonomic response. They push down on anything in their vicinity and they'll drown you too. You can't cry out for help. They call drowning the silent killer. Because if you're drowning, we always think, well, why don't you just call out for help? Because speaking is a secondary feature of your body. The primary feature is breathing. If you stop someone from breathing, they can't speak. You're just too busy trying to inhale. And so you spend the last little bit of energy you have, the last little bit of air you have, speaking something. That's why they call drowning the silent killer. People drown 10 feet away from their parent and never call out because they can't, because their body shuts down the secondary features to focus on the primary one, which is breathing. We take breathing for granted, but imagine if you couldn't breathe. We take water for granted. Imagine if you didn't have water. We take food for granted. Imagine if you didn't have food. But then when you get over those basic things, and we don't even notice the things that we are. The whole world, there's a whole trucking industry that brings everything to us that we're not even aware of, and who works for really poor wages through a very complicated system of subcontracting that allows them to get paid oftentimes less than minimum wage for their work. But there's a whole trucking system that takes place overnight. When you go to sleep at night, trucks are traveling all over Southern California and this country delivering things. We don't use trains anymore for stuff. And we do, but not for food and things like that. And so we're dependent for all these things, and we just don't even notice. And so there's some value in just pausing and thinking about that, and reflecting and thinking about how the world still functions, although we are in a bubble where we don't notice it. It's like a let them eat cake kind of thing, where the rich aristocracy doesn't know what it's like, how the masses live. We are the rich aristocracy. If you live in Southern California, you're the rich aristocracy of the world. If you just cross the border into Mexico, and I don't even you don't have to go deep into Mexico, just go over to TJ. It is a whole different world, an hour and a half from here. Whole different world. We're politicians. Hundreds and hundreds of politicians are assassinated every year in Mexico. They did a study into police corruption about 10 years ago in Mexico to rout out police corruption. And they discovered that police corruption was so rampant at the state level in Mexico that they could not rehabilitate it, and they had to federalize the police force. And now there's a federal police force all over Mexico, and they're the only ones who can actually deal with the cartels because the state police force is all bought and paid for. In fact, many times you end up getting the state police fighting with the federal police. Let me say that again. Oftentimes the state police are so well paid, they end up becoming the militia of the cartels and fight against the federal police. That's an hour and a half from here. Honestly, it's not an hour and a half. I can do it in an hour and 10 minutes. Wild, right? You wonder, why are all these Mexican people, walking through the desert? A friend of mine's a firefighter, and in the summertime, he works in San Diego County for the fire department. In the summertime, most of what they do is they put out fires that are lit purposefully by migrants illegally crossing. I don't know what the proper word is. Migrant doesn't sound right. But people trying to illegally cross from Mexico into the U.S. They spend most of their time doing that. And sometimes you have to get on a helicopter and fly out into the desert in 120-degree heat to go put out a fire. It was caused by somebody who was crossing the desert. You know why? Why are these desert crossers starting fires? That's a good one, though. Yeah. Huh? Heat up some food. No, that's a good one too. Dalen? Distraction. No, you guys are getting really clever here. Yeah. To be rescued. Yeah, he's a police officer. He knows. Howard's a cop, so he knows. Because it's 110 degrees out there and they're dying and they run out of water. And so the rule of thumb that all the illegal immigrants know is that if you run out of water and you're about to die of dehydration, light a fire, start a fire, because the U.S. has this insane firefighting department, and they'll helicopter in and save you. And in fact, that's what they spend most of their summer doing, is helicoptering in to save people who are dying, who are a couple hours away from dying because they run out of water, because that's what this place is like if we didn't divert to Colorado. The Colorado River. So there's actually value. It kind of sobers you up and makes you more thoughtful and grateful, and makes you less indulgent and makes you less entitled and ungrateful and exploitative and ignorant and blind, foolish and materialistic. Thinking about these things is curative, and it broadens your horizons, and it makes you more appreciative for the basic necessities of life that are almost a given if you live in Southern California. Our Thanksgiving tradition isn't about that. It's light years away from that. We should be thankful for all this stuff, but our tradition and what we give thanks to starts after all that has been understood and imbibed and appreciated. So everything we just talked about is irrelevant for tonight's class. However, everything we just talked about is assumed. Like if you walk into a Spanish 3 class, it's assumed that you've taken Spanish 1 and 2. That's why you're in the Spanish 3 class. So because I didn't want to assume all this, we took a little bit of time to walk through some ways in which we should be incredibly grateful, incredibly appreciative, some ways in which we have artificially removed the struggle of life that's still all around us and that goes hand in hand with the shortening days which vex and bother us. Well, I'm just going to tell the story. The story is about gratitude to divinity, to God, to your source, to the omnipotent, omnibenevolent, omniscient creator of the universe. It's a story about gratitude towards God, but it's not a story about gratitude towards God for food, water, shelter, companionship, creature comforts, TV, computers, cell phones, systems of mass transit, automobiles, gas-driven engines. It's not thanks for all those things. Although we should be thankful for those things, and if you're not, you need to spend some more time thinking about that stuff, which is why we did the exercise we did. Here's the story. In heaven, and we know the story because our sacred tradition, the saints in our sacred tradition, thousands of years ago, wrote this stuff down and said this stuff was revealed to them. Just like Moses got, the 10 Commandments from God, or just like Joseph Smith got the golden tablets from God, or just like Abraham and Moses had regular interactions with the deity and then communicated to their tribe the desires of God, just like all religion is founded by somebody, Muhammad, saying Allah said this, Allah spoke this, Allah wants you to do this. And so either you're the prophet and you're hearing from God directly, or you're hearing from someone who purports to have heard from God. And when you meet somebody you feel like the message they're teaching is divinely inspired, then you call it truth and you become a follower of a tradition. Instead of reinventing the wheel or starting from scratch and being the prophet of your own tradition, you borrow from it, stand on the shoulders of giants, and see further than you might see on your own. So our sacred tradition, our saints thousands of years ago wrote this stuff down, and they say this is what's going on in heaven. So in heaven, and you just roll with me into the story, because we're not going to be able to button every single aspect of it up. Some of it we're just going to have to speak, and then maybe we'll clean some of it up on the back end. In heaven, Krishna, God, the all-attractive one, which is what the word Krishna means, Krishna loves his angelic devotees, and they love him. And their love burns so brightly that it burns up all formality and all hegemonic distinctions between God, who is great, and the devotees who are small. And they love so intensely and so brightly in that fire of their love for one another, because Krishna is also capable of love, that it burns up any sense of formality. And the devotees forget that Krishna is God. They just love him so much, they forget he's God, and they just run up to him and embrace him and dance with him and play with him. And Krishna becomes the best friend of his angelic devotees in the corner of heaven that we aspire to go to. We have another corner of heaven where it's well established and well attested to in our sacred tradition, where God exists as Vishnu, who is great. He's so great he has 4 arms. To distinguish that he's not like you. And everybody knows how powerful he is. And the activities of heaven consist largely of bowing down and offering prayers and begging for mercy and that kind of stuff. But the Krishna corner of heaven is when, just like a judge goes to court and puts on his vestments and then, presides, and then people call him your honor, and they have to speak to him very, very formally. They have to stand when he walks in, stand when he leaves. He can hold them in contempt for any reason he so chooses. They make you give up your weapons before you're allowed to go in the courtroom. And then when you're in the courtroom, there's police officers all around, including in the room you're in. And anytime the judge wants to, he can hold you in contempt. And the police officers will arrest you and put you in jail. And he needs no other reason than he just says it. You're in contempt. Take him away. And if you try to get out, you can't get out because there's police officers all over the building and they're all armed and you're not. And you're captured. You're trapped. When you go to court, you're in a cage. It doesn't look like it. It looks like a room, but you're actually in a cage and you can't get out. So that judge is there and he's, in many ways, all-powerful. He can control you with just his words. You can imagine how... Normally we don't think about that, but that's actually the physical situation you're in whenever you go to court. But then that judge takes off his vestments and goes home and fights with his wife or fights with her husband, argues with the kids, does homework, plays piggyback, cooks dinner, wipes their kid's backside. They have a whole different world once they take off those vestments and they can just be themselves with their family. Which people know the judge better? The criminals in the courtroom who have to dress him as your honor and stand up and sit down and do whatever he says, that he has absolute power over? Maybe not absolute power, but significant power over? Or his family members who will tell him to shut up or will take the remote and change the station on the TV or argue with him or joke around or call her names or demand things. Who knows the judge better? Family does. That's our corner of heaven when you become Krishna's family. And so in that corner of heaven, there's a devotee who thinks of herself as Krishna's mother. A devotee who thinks of themselves as Krishna's father, or Krishna's friend, or Krishna's lover. It's just a group of people who love Krishna like their own family member and forget about his power. They're filled with love where they want to protect Krishna. They want to care for Krishna. They want to play with Krishna. And everybody drops their titles and just loves each other. That's our conception of heaven. And so one day, Krishna's mother was churning butter. Now you're going to start to wonder how tangential my tangent was. Krishna's mother was churning butter. What does that mean? It means she had a big pot of yogurt and a stick in the yogurt. She was going to actually use a string on a stick, and you move the stick real fast with the string. And she was churning the yogurt into butter. Did you guys know that you can make butter from yogurt? Of course you can. It's full fat milk. It has a certain fat content. If you make full fat yogurt, same fat content's there. It's had some probiotics added to it, and you can churn butter, and actually, amazingly, the probiotics are in the butter too. So you end up with a butter that has digestive enzymes in it. So she was churning butter out of yogurt. And Krishna woke up. His mother was singing songs about Krishna because she loves Krishna so much she naturally just does kirtan about her son. And Krishna woke up. That's a mind blower, that Krishna's sleeping in heaven. And woke up and ran to his mother and started nagging at her cloth, wanting to be fed. And Yashoda picked Krishna up, sat him on her lap, and looked at her son's beautiful face that looked like a lake of liquefied sapphires. Dark color, beautiful, translucent, supreme being who would become her son. And breast milk was pouring from her breasts, her spiritual breasts. And her breasts are made out of eternality, bliss, and knowledge. And the milk that was pouring from them is also made out of eternality, bliss, and knowledge. And she was associating in heaven, in an eternal form, with the Supreme Lord who also has an eternal form. And what were they doing? She was feeding him. Filled with spiritual affection and love. And then she saw the milk on the fire, on the hearth in their home, was boiling over. And so she had to jump up and drop Krishna. Not drop him on the floor like a sack of potatoes, but just put him down. And she ran to go tend to the affairs of the household. Just totally wrapped up in motherly affection for Krishna, so much so that she even... Did you guys go up to LA? Did you go to LA?
No.
Just came here?
Yeah, we were listening in the car.
Okay. She put Krishna down, and she was so wrapped up in motherly affection that she thought, I have to take care of the household. I have to put my son down because that's my duty, is to take care of the household and take care of him. And I don't want the house to burn down or something like that. And so she dropped God and ran off to tend to the affairs of the house. In a house made out of eternality, bliss, and knowledge, where the fire was made out of eternity, and the pot was made out of bliss, and the milk was made out of knowledge. You get the idea. Everything was eternal. Everything was conscious. When we think about heaven, we think about an abode of pure consciousness, where there's no flesh and blood and carbon, but where the whole place is just like you have a spark of consciousness within you, but it's a whole world of consciousness. Such that when Yashoda, Krishna's mother, is cooking for Krishna, she's cooking rice, she will ask the rice if it's done cooking. And the rice will say, yes, we're done cooking. Take us off the flame. She could also potentially talk to the fire, because everything is conscious. The grass and the trees talk to one another. It's an abode of everything is made out of, every iota of the spiritual world is made out of consciousness. Anyway, so you should have put Krishna down and ran off to turn the fire off. And Krishna got angry and started crying. And took a rock and broke a hole in the pot and grabbed a bunch of butter out of it and ran off. Yashoda finished her motherly duties of taking the milk off the flame, and turned around, saw Krishna was gone, saw the broken pot with yogurt and butter pouring out of it, and then saw these little tiny footprints leading away from the pot, and she could understand Krishna had butter all over his feet, and he was walking away, and he was tracking the butter and the yogurt. So she followed the footsteps into another room of the house, into the cold room of the house. These cold rooms are sunken down in the earth a little bit. I mean, nobody has this anymore. I've been in cold rooms in India where they're just kind of dug into the earth, and so it's like a cellar. But then it being dug into the earth means it's cooler, and when it's hot outside, that heat does not, it doesn't affect you. If you down low enough and it's thick enough, it doesn't heat up. You ever been in like one of those rooms? Because you didn't grow up in a village, right?
Yeah.
You just don't remember it? Okay. So there was a cold room, and there was, different items hanging up actually by ropes, so the animals and what have you couldn't get to it. Just like you hang your food up from a tree so bears can't get to it. And there was a grinding mortar on the ground, a big grinding mortar, a large one used for grinding grains. And Krishna turned it over. It's called an ulukala. Krishna turned it over and it climbed up on top of it. And he was going up into the pots that were hung up high and breaking them too, getting stuff out of them, and then feeding the monkeys. Which sounds insane unless you've been to India, and you would know this could totally happen. And Krishna was looking around because he knew he was going to get in trouble for this. And so his mother got right at his 6, right behind him, so he couldn't see her. So he was looking around like this. But even if I'm looking around like this, I can't see what's right here. So she crept up behind him with a stick in her hand. And Krishna eventually saw her and ran away. Jumped off the grinding mortar and ran away. And Yashoda ran after him. And so there's this image. There's this image that Yashoda, she has a thin waist, big breasts. She's wearing a saffron-colored sari. She has a beautiful chain made out of pure spirit around her waist. She's got malati flowers, jasmine flowers in her hair. And she's running after Krishna, perspiring. And malati flowers are falling from her hair, and her braids coming undone, and Krishna's running too, and she's running after Krishna. And she catches him. And then she brings him back in the house, and she ties him up, or whatever, in the courtyard, and she ties him up to this grinding mortar. It's a big, large item. And he's a small child. So she gets some ropes and she ties him up to the grinding mortar so he can't get away. Krishna, in the meantime, is crying. His mascara's all over his face, which just makes him look more beautiful somehow. And she can't tie the knot. The rope is just a little bit too short to tie that knot. 2 fingers too short, just a little bit too short to tie the knot. So she goes and gets another piece of rope. Still 2 fingers too short. And she gets another one. And now her friends start coming around, and they start bringing all the rope in the village. And they still can't tie Krishna up. And now Yashoda is really perspiring. She's in anxiety. She feels she's not doing a good job of being Krishna's mother. And then we have a verse. Looks like I didn't get saved. Oof. All right, let me look it up. Evam Sandarshita. Evam Sandarshita Anga. Boom! Look at that. First time. And we have a verse. Oh, it's not the verse I wanted. I have that one saved. Hold on. This one is... Ooh. Bahir Antar Purva Param. I don't know how to get there. Okay, here we go, guys. Sorry about that. And here it is. And here's the verse. Nacha antar na bahir yasya. The person who has no inside and no outside. Na purvam napi cha aparam. No beginning and no end. Purvam aparam. But he is the beginning and end. Bahir cha antar. And outside and inside. Jagata yo jagat chaya. He is the beginning and end and outside and inside of the whole universe. You follow? There's a person, and that person has no beginning and no end, no inside, no outside, but they themselves are the outside and inside, beginning and end of all things. That person. Tam matva atmajam avyaktam. That invisible person, thinking of him as her son. Martya lingam adhoksajam. That person who's beyond the senses, thinking of him as their child. Gokulu ulukale damna babanda prakritam yata. She bound him to the ulukala, to the grinding mortar, just like you would bind an ordinary child. So Krishna is showing nothing can bind him. And then all of a sudden, the person who has no beginning and no end, no inside, no outside, but they are the beginning and end, outside and inside of the whole universe. That person became bound by his mother as if he was an ordinary child. And why is that? Because evam sandarshita hyanga harina vritya vashyata. Because he's teaching you that the Lord has the quality of being vritya vashyata, controlled by his devotee. Swavasenapi, even though he is in charge of everything. Krishnena yasya idam sa ishwadam vashe. And the whole universe and all the controllers of the universe are under his control. And he's omnipotent and he is absolute and he's in charge of everything. That person was teaching that Horina Vritya Vashyata, that the Lord can be controlled by his devotee. This is what the story teaches us. That bhakti, that the love that the residents of Vrindavan have, that the love that Yashoda has, that the love that is enshrined in our tradition, that the love we cultivate, the love which eventually overwhelms feelings of distinction and feelings of higher and lower and feelings of who's powerful and who's weak and who's knowledgeable and who's stupid, and a pure love that just makes everybody feel like they are friends, best friends. That love is so attractive, is so powerful, that even Krishna himself becomes controlled by it. And a deity that wasn't susceptible to love, a deity that wasn't affectable by love, a deity that didn't become transformed through love, would be deficient. A full conception of divinity means you have to think that God has the best of all features of the world. So he's in control of everything. He's absolute. But if you're only absolute and never relative, then you have no compassion and no empathy and no feeling for another. Love means vulnerability. And so Krishna is that aspect of divinity, that ultimate person of divinity, who is vulnerable, available, affectable, empathetic, compassionate, feeling. That's Supreme Lord. And so the Supreme Lord, who is the outside and inside of the universe, the beginning and the end of all things, who himself has no beginning and end, and has nothing outside himself and nothing within himself, and is the supreme in every way, that Supreme Lord became bound. And why did he become bound? Because the Lord has a quality which is part of his infinite glories, which is that he is controllable by love. And when Yashoda bound Krishna, she showed that and taught that to everybody, and that's what we're thankful for. That's what we're thankful for. That's what we give Thanksgiving for. So you need to start by being thankful for the oxygen you breathe and the water that you drink and the land that you stand on and the shelter you have and the fires you have that keep you warm and the clothes you have that protect you and the food you eat and the sun and the universe and the atmosphere and our proximity to the sun and the days and the nights and the seasons and the months. You need to be thankful for all of it. The water cycle, everything. A police force that you can, generally speaking, trust at least like a little bit. You're not going to get assassinated or kidnapped walking down the street. One of our devotees got stabbed in the throat. There was a drug addict in Long Beach who went and stabbed 4 people, killed one of them. One of the 4 people he stabbed was Jordan. I got a call this week from one of our devotees. He got stabbed in the throat. Some guy jumped in his car and had a bag of crystal meth and said, let's do some crystal meth together. And Jordan said, no, please leave. And the guy said, and stabbed him in the throat. And Jordan drove himself to the hospital, or drove himself halfway to the hospital. And the knife wound went all the way to his spine, touched his spine. Somehow it missed all his vital organs. It's got a few stitches. No stitches, actually. They just used Dermabond. Right? So random, isn't it? So anyway, I made the point that we can, we're relatively safe here, but with some few exceptions. We're relatively more safe than you are across the border, but not without exceptions, not without caveats, not without qualifiers. And so when you're done being thankful for the earth and the water and the air and the atmosphere and the sun and day and night and the water cycle and the food you eat and your companions and your friends and your family, when you get that, you let that seep into you, and you live a life of gratitude, and eventually you realize, well, wait a second, there's somebody behind all of this, and I need to be grateful to them, because gratitude is always towards a person. You're never grateful to a formula. You're never grateful to a force. You're always grateful to a person, because it means they did you a favor. And if it's a blind system, there's nobody's doing you a favor, and therefore there's no need to be grateful. So the sentiment of gratitude is always based on the idea that you feel grateful because somebody went the extra mile for you and gave you more than you deserved. If you got what you deserved, it's called entitlement. Gratitude is when you feel like you got more than you deserved, and that means somebody did things in your favor, and that means there's a person behind it, and at some point you become grateful to the Lord. And then you're grateful for all the things I mentioned. And then once that's all done, you can start to think higher up in the pyramid, beyond just food and the basic necessities of life, and you can start to think about bigger things that you're grateful for. And the ultimate thing our tradition came up with thousands of years ago to be grateful for was we're grateful that the Supreme Lord, the one without a second, bigger than the biggest, smaller than the smallest, beyond everything, within everything, beyond day and night, beyond the senses, faster than the speed of the mind, what was a Superman? More powerful than a locomotive? Was it? Faster than a speeding bullet. Krishna's way faster than a speeding bullet. He's faster than the speed of the mind. You can never catch Krishna. But there's one way you can catch Krishna. And that's through loving. And so a deity that wasn't moved by love, a deity that wasn't transformed by love, is no deity of mine. And so our theologians, they thought through all the things in the world to be thankful for. And they thought this one is the most special. And so this is our Star of David on top of our Christmas tree in our season of thankfulness. And this is what we focus on. And that's why you see pictures of Krishna as a child. And that's why you offer lamps to Krishna as a child. That's why you sing songs about Krishna as a child. That's why our iconography is the way it is. There's this deep, beautiful point, which is exemplified by and fleshed out in this beautiful story, which itself is so wonderful that by hearing it in the right mood, it transforms your heart and makes you think, yeah, that is the most beautiful thing. That is the thing we should be grateful for. What? That Krishna, who's faster than the speed of the mind, who's bigger than everything, who's beyond everything, who's transcendent, who's unlimitedly powerful, who knows everything. That Supreme Lord is so simple that all you have to do is love him, and that's enough. He's available to your love. He'll shrink down to accept your love and change the structure of the universe to accommodate your love. And that's what's being glorified and appreciated this month. Thank you very much. Let's do a little kirtan. Hare Krishna.